Sometime in the early 1990s, I was in a waiting room at the dentist or doctor. I can't remember which. But I was bored and I began looking for something to read. I picked up a book I found on the magazine strewn table, a scuffed and much abused paperback. I didn't pay any attention to the author or the title, but just started to read. Not really expecting anything, I found myself being drawn into a story that at first was strange, and then as I read on became increasingly bizarre. I was hooked, and my boring waiting room experience disappeared into the unfolding drama. The book I'd found was a copy of Jacques Vallee's Confrontations. But I only discovered that much later when I began researching the whole UFO phenomenon. It began with a prologue in which the author describes a journey he made in 1980 to Rio de Janeiro. He was there to investigate the strange death of two men and their connection to some UFO activity in the area at that time. Now, as a man of rigorous and scrupulous scientific training, he would always visit the sites of alleged UFO activity and talk to witnesses himself before drawing any conclusions. Therefore, his books on the subject are always the result of his own research, his own scientific analysis, which makes him one of the most trustworthy researchers in the field. The incident Vallee describes had occurred long before his arrival, way back in 1966, but the witnesses were still alive, and Vallee wanted to talk to them and also examine the location where the whole tragic event occurred. So the prologue begins with his climb up Vintim Hill in the district of Niterói in Rio de Janeiro. He was there to find the location where the bodies of two men, electronic technicians Miguel Jose Viana, 34, and Manuel Pereira da Cruz, 32, were found. At the time, the incident was investigated as a possible murder or suicide, but all the efforts of the local police had revealed no evidence for either, and after many attempts to solve the case, it eventually had been abandoned. It seemed it was some classic cold case scenario. But there were circumstances surrounding the story that added a really unusual twist. Jacques Vallee's investigation attempts to reconstruct the events leading up to that fateful night. The two men had traveled by bus from their home in Campos to Niterói, leaving word that they were going to purchase a car. They had enough cash on them to buy a cheap used car, around about 3 million cruzeiros, which apparently is roughly about $1,000. On their bodies were receipts for the raincoats they were wearing, since it was raining that day, and they had a receipt for a bottle of water, needed to return the bottle later to get the deposit back. However, most of the money was unaccounted for, as they had only a small amount left on them. When police questioned the clerk who had sold them the water, she said they seemed agitated and concerned about the time, and that it was getting dark and starting to rain. They then hitched a ride up the hill with two unidentified men in a jeep. They had purchased a bottle of mineral water from the bar at 3:15, and they set off for Vintim Hill, and they were last seen about 5 p.m. This was the last time they were seen alive. Jacques Vallee was later able to locate this police officer, and he also found the resident, and they actually accompanied him to the very spot where they found these bodies. What they described to him was the two bodies were dressed in raincoats and they had suits on. There were a few items with them. There was no sign of violence. The cause of death was difficult to ascertain because decomposition had already set in. But they were examined by the coroner, and apparently an examination of the bowels was able to rule out poisoning. And eventually he ruled that they had died of cardiac arrest and closed the file. Dissatisfied with this, the police ordered another autopsy, which was made, but nothing new came to light, and the coroner could give no clue as to the manner of their deaths. So then attention was switched to the puzzling discovery that was made next to the bodies. There were two crudely made lead masks, which gives this whole story its famous title. In addition to these, there was a small notebook. On one page was a list of electronic part numbers, probably pertaining to their repair business, although some people have interpreted them as encrypted codes with a special meaning, but there was no confirmation of that. There was a slip of paper found next to the bodies, which was more interesting. And what was written on that was in Portuguese. In translation goes, meet at the designated spot at 4:30 p.m. At 6:30 p.m. ingest the capsules. After the effect is produced, protect half the face with lead masks. Wait for pre-arranged signal. That was the message. They didn't find any capsules, and if the men had taken any capsules, possibly poisonous, then we never learned the reason why or what kind of capsules they were. So, questions still remain. What were they doing there? Did they believe that some UFO was coming to pick them up? Or was it some strange spiritualist experiment that went wrong? In the subsequent days and weeks, the police began to receive phone calls from the public. Gracinda Barbosa was a well-known local society matron, and she phoned them reportedly having seen a strange object in the sky hovering over Vintim Hill. It was orange in color, oval, and sending out rays of light in all directions. Vallee also describes further to this investigation a visit to his home in Chicago by a well-respected researcher, a medical doctor called Dr. Olavo Fontes. He had made his own investigation into the lead masks case, and he wanted to show Vallee another UFO sighting in the Niterói region. A luminous object seen by a 54-year-old electronics firm manager who was accompanied by his family. He had drawn a sketch of some effervescent spheres, very similar to the one described by Mrs. De Souza. In addition to these UFO reports, the investigation took a different turn when it was discovered that the two men were involved in some kind of spiritualist group or occult society with unknown objectives. The investigators met with a friend of the man, a civilian pilot named Alcio da Silva, who was connected to the same spiritualist group. He had been involved in some kind of technical experimentation with the deceased, which had resulted in some kind of explosion that had went off on a couple of occasions, apparently making quite a noise. It was discovered also there was some kind of altercation between them, and so on the strength of this, the police interrogated and even arrested him, but they found out that he was not anywhere near Niterói at the time, and he also could not supply any useful information. All they could ascertain was the men seemed to believe they could in some manner contact extraterrestrials using some kind of radio device or apparatus that they might have been trying to manufacture. All of this basically completed the investigation. No new leads came up after this.